I hear Christians often talk about God's blessing, about counting on God's blessing, that who has God's blessing has everything. But be careful, because we must never over-spiritualize matters nor fall into a law of minimum effort, because God not only demands that we trust in Him, but also that we put in the effort and take courage, because we cannot do it alone, nor should we. Welcome to our devotional, Mana, where we listen to and obey the Lord's word. Okay, we're talking about Joseph, and truly I want to say that there's a matter in Christianity that concerns me a great deal, and this is that sometimes we tend to spiritualize things. I am convinced that God's blessing is what enriches, and it's not about working a lot, and I preach about this, you hear me. But I must say, often people think that they must just sit and wait for God's blessing to fall from heaven, and I find sometimes that there are stewards, managers to whom God gives challenges, but they do not fulfill the tasks. They're not diligent. But allow me to tell you, the best example of what we should do in regards to this point is Joseph. We already saw everything Pharaoh did. He dressed him in fine linen. He gave him a gold necklace. He put a ring on his finger. He placed him in his chariot and told him, "You're going to govern the whole land, the entire nation." But we're going to read several verses where we see that Joseph never took anything for granted. On the contrary, the next day he got up early to do all that he needed to do. And look, I want to highlight in the life of Joseph, where in Genesis 39, it talks about when he was with his first master, Potiphar. Here it says that God was with him and God's blessing was over Joseph, and that everything he did prospered. But what did this involve? It involved intense work. It required order, administration, planning, leadership. So this wasn't a matter that Joseph had God's blessing, so everything fell from heaven. No, we as Christians have to understand that God has given us gifts, talents, that the Bible makes us wise and understanding. But if we have the ability to do things, to prepare ourselves, to study, or through the career that you are in now, gain the experience to become wise, perform your work effectively, efficiently, then this is welcome. So let's talk about the experiences of the men of the Bible. There are three men that I mention often, and we're talking about one of them today. I always talk about three men which give us a wonderful example of this topic that we are discussing today: Daniel, Nehemiah, and Joseph. Look, when we talk about Daniel, all the kings would fight over Daniel so that he would work for them. And these were pagan kings that did not trust in God. But the Bible highlights of Daniel that he was a man 10 times wiser than anyone who was wise in Israel. The Bible tells us that although Daniel was set traps so that he would not seek his God, so that he wouldn't kneel, and so that he would become separated from God and His Word, he never obeyed them. And when the kings see his characteristics of wisdom, integrity, and the faithfulness of this man, this is why they fight over him, because they know that there are very few like him. And so they wanted to work with Daniel. And by decree, these kings ordering for Daniel's God to be worshipped. And this is where the Bible invites us to be light in the world. We do not necessarily have to preach with the Bible in hand, nor constantly always having to mention God and shouting hallelujah. No, a life with the characteristics of the life of Daniel is sufficiently influential and attractive, where many are going to ask, who is this person and why do they do what they do? The second character is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was also in a very difficult position, like Joseph, because they came with the news to Nehemiah that Jerusalem had been destroyed. And so he kneels, he fasted, he prayed. The Bible tells us that he prayed for 4 months until God gave him the opportunity to be interviewed by the king. But what's most interesting about this interview is that he tells the king his plans. And the text in Nehemiah chapter 2 says, when it says that the king asked him, "What do you want?" And after he laid out his plans to the king, it says that it pleased the king to send him. And so look at what's interesting here. Nehemiah had prayed and fasted. But when asked, "What are you going to do with Jerusalem? What do you need?" he did not doubt for a moment. His plan was very clear and precise, and here lies the secret of stewardship. And the secret is that we must learn to make plans. The secret of stewardship is that we must learn to have a budget, clear goals, knowing where I am heading, what I need, what I want. Have you asked yourself these questions? Because sometimes we spiritualize everything and we say, "Lord, bless me." But what if God were to appear to you this morning, right now in this devotional time, and if he would ask you, "What do you want?" There's a good possibility that we would not know what to ask him for. Perhaps we may say, "Well, yes, I need this, that," and so on. But what do you need? Do you have a plan? Did you write it down? Do you have a goal? Are you completely sure of the steps and the resources you need to reach this goal? Are you prepared? Now look, what did Joseph have to do? We spoke about Daniel, Nehemiah. Now let's talk about Joseph. Joseph had a 14-year plan. During the first 7 years, his challenge was to get to know Egypt, to become familiar with its agriculture, to come up with a plan for the storehouses because they were to store up as much as they could. What was the condition of the roads and the transportation systems? He was to put together a logistic team because the logistics were going to be key in order to store, to guard, and to keep records. In addition to this, the way he treated people was crucial. And so do you see here, we're not talking about a Joseph where, "Oh, Joseph, God is with you. Just sit there and do nothing and everything's going to fall from heaven. Everything's going to be perfect." No, that's not what happens here. And I want Christians to understand this. What you are living right now at this time, for the most part, has been your responsibility. Because often, what has led to this has been laziness, negligence, poor administration, debts, poor stewardship, and many of the situations that we find ourselves in today, we cannot blame God for. Nor can we say, "Why isn't God blessing me?" or "Why God this or that?" No, we cannot blame God for this because God has given us blessings and he has made promises to us, but he wants us to be responsible. Look, when I begin to read what Joseph did, it says in Genesis 41:46, it says that Joseph traveled throughout all of Egypt. And so we just talked about the challenges that Joseph faced. But the first thing he did was to go and travel the land, to become familiar with it. Fields, harvests, regions, roads, means of transportation. Joseph could not have been able to do everything alone or without establishing processes and methods of execution and supervision. And look, Genesis chapter 41 verses 48 and 49. Joseph stored up the grain in different cities. And so, during the 7 years of famine that followed, Joseph distributed the grain to the Egyptians and others that were affected by the extensive famine. And this required an exceptional talent to create and administrate all of these things in order to survive for the following 7 years of famine. Chapter 47 of Genesis tells us, and here we're moving on to the second part. It says that when the people had no more money left, so Joseph had filled the storehouses and he was being a steward to manage all the food, not allowing people to consume all the food at once. And this is what a good administrator, good steward does. My dear family, there's a time of abundance and also a time of scarcity. And so there is a time when what is wisest is to save. We cannot consume everything. Don't walk around with a spirit of spending, splurging, buying, wasting, or saying, "Well, I have plenty." No. Yes, we must enjoy, but it is very important to save and plan for the future, to invest. Planning for the future. There's nothing wrong with this. This is not a sin. No, this is how we use the wisdom that God has given us. And so the Bible tells us during the second half or the following 7 years of famine, and when the people began to run out of money, do you know what it says in chapter 47 verses 15 and 17 through 17? Joseph allowed the people to exchange their livestock for food, and this plan lasted a year, where Joseph amassed horses, sheep, goats, cattle, donkeys. Do you know what this means? This was a time of famine, but because Joseph had prepared and there was enough food, he was able to tell the people, "Come, bring me your cattle, your livestock, and I'll give you food." Incredible, no? He must have determined the value of the livestock and established a fair system to exchange, and he carried this out. Let's continue. When there were no longer any livestock left to negotiate, it says that the people would sell themselves as slaves willingly, and it says that they also sold their lands to Pharaoh in chapter 47, verses 18 through 21. So when we look at this, when we see what Joseph did, Joseph allowed the people to sell their lands and to become slaves, but he did not take advantage of them in their state of defenselessness. Joseph made sure that they were paid the right price for their property and that they were given a fair exchange for seeds to plant. In Genesis 47:23, he approves a permanent law where people would return to Pharaoh 20% of their crops, and this implied a system to monitor, to ensure the law was fulfilled, and then a system to administrate the earnings. But it also tells us that Joseph helped the priests of that time, and he asked Pharaoh to give them a special portion and to not charge them taxes. And look, I love the story that we're talking about today because this is the story that we very rarely hear about Joseph. Because what we hear about the most is where Joseph was blessed by God, where Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and this is why God was with him. But no, I would like for us to analyze this part. A Joseph who was involved, committed, focused, dedicated, studious, a planner, a leader, an organizer. And I believe this is where we as Christians must make progress. Let's look at the world. In the world, everybody prepares to be the best, and they fight and compete to be the best. But why? Because they want to earn money, to have certain roles or positions. But why are not we as children of God precisely in these positions of influence for God's name to be known? This is what Daniel did. This is what Nehemiah did. And this is what Joseph did. And this is what God calls for us to do. And so I believe that our spirituality must be made concrete in real acts, especially when we talk about finances, about economy, stewardship, administration, and management. I hope God is truly speaking to your heart. And please send us your comments through the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, send them to us and we will answer. But family, what is God speaking to your life? What is God speaking to your heart? The Bible tells us that we must take courage. We must be brave, committed, focused. The Bible tells us that we must work with strength and be committed to all that we do. Pray with me and let's turn this day over to the Lord. Father, thank you for this morning, for the beginning of this new day. We have your blessing. Your presence is with us, but the Bible tells us that we must put in the effort and take courage, that we must use the intelligence and the abilities, the talents you have given us, that we must be ready, we must be prepared, and that each day, Lord, we're to use what you have given us to help others. We give you our lives, our hearts, and we thank you for being amongst us. We commend ourselves to you, and we ask for your blessing. And I wait for you tomorrow in our Friday of prayer and Mana. Blessings to all.